Thanks for the question. My discussion today in relation to recognition of states and governments refers to the body of international law that deals with the question of recognition. Within international law, there is no single source in terms of a treaty that outlines the requirements or the rules or processes of recognition. Instead, it is something that arises from different sources in terms of principles and practices of states. Within the modern era, state practice has moved towards a dominant theory called declarative theory. Declarative theory says that recognition is discretionary. Discretionary means it's at the discretion of the state to decide how it's going to recognize other states. Because recognition is discretionary, this means that it is a political act. It is, however, a political act that carries legal consequences. In terms of understanding the application of declarative theory and how states exercise discretion in recognizing other states or recognizing governments, there are two principles to remember. So with international law, there is something called the Estrada Doctrine. So this is something that happened or arose from the Mexican Secretary of Foreign Affairs named Don Genaro Estrada in 1930. And the principle of the Estrada Doctrine is that we recognize states, but we do not recognize governments. And this is the difference between the two. This is becoming a more dominant theory. It's something that's practiced by countries such as the United States and Australia. In addition to the Estrada Doctrine is something called the Stimson Doctrine. So this is from the Secretary of State, Henry Stimson of the United States from 1931. And this means that it's an application of a Latin principle, ex injuria jus non oritur. So that's a Latin term, ex injuria jus non oritur. What this means is that legal status or legal rights cannot result from an illegal act. So you cannot have an illegal act that leads to a legal process of recognition. Having said that, I had mentioned earlier that recognition is a political process. And so indeed, if you look at the way states apply these legal principles, it becomes a very politicized process. I'll refer to American history because that is what I'm familiar with, just to show you how political things can become. The United States at various times has paid reference to notions of effective control or legitimacy. In situations where there was transition that occurred through a constitutional process, or where a transition was accepted by the majority of the population, the US has made reference to the doctrine of legitimacy and has paid attention to the legitimacy of a regime that's in control of the state. The United States has also paid attention to something called effective control. So in situations where there was a transition that did not follow a constitutional process, the United States has then had discussions about, does the regime have effective control over the state? Please note that both of these discussions are dealing with recognition of a government, even though the United States asserts that it follows the Estrada Doctrine, where it does not recognize governments, but recognizes states. In addition, the United States, even though it insists that it only recognizes states, has in the past recognized governments. Most notably in 2019, the United States recognized the status of the head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, in Venezuela, as a legitimate acting interim president of the state of Venezuela. Before that, in 1982, the United States recognized the national government of Cambodia, which is a government in exile that was based outside of Cambodia, as a legitimate government of the state of Cambodia. In addition, the United States has also distinguished between a government that represents the state versus an organization that represents the people. So in 2011, in the case of Libya, the United States started off in March 13th of recognizing the transitional National Council as a legitimate interlocutor for the Libyan people, but not as a legitimate government. So legitimate interlocutor means that it is an entity that speaks on behalf of the Libyan people, although it does not speak on behalf of the Libyan state. 1 month later, in May, the United States changed its position and said that it recognized the Transitional National Council as a legitimate representative of the state of Libya. So it shows you just how fluid the position can be. The last point I'll make regarding the politicization or the political process of recognition is an example of China and Taiwan. So in 1979, the United States changed its recognition of Taiwan and the government in Taiwan as a legitimate representative of the state of China, and instead recognized the People's Republic of China and Beijing as a regime that was the legitimate government that represented the entity, the state of China. Now, why is it that we have these kinds of discussions, and why is it that things become politicized? From the American perspective in American history, there is a need to maintain flexibility in terms of granting legal rights. And so flexibility in terms of who the US decides should have political support, who the US wants to negotiate with, who the US decides it wants to have diplomatic status or diplomatic relations, who the US decides should have control over assets, state property. This includes things like embassy buildings, sovereign bank accounts, land, et cetera. And so these kinds of concerns you'll see are ultimately the drivers of recognition and when states in the modern era choose to take exceptions to the Estrada Doctrine. So once again, I'll emphasize the Estrada Doctrine is that we recognize states, not governments, but that the nature of international politics and international relations invariably calls upon states to make political exceptions to the Estrada Doctrine in terms of recognizing a government, in terms of recognizing interlocutors, in terms of recognizing who speaks for the sake of international discussions or negotiations. So I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
Raises some issues for me, which start in my thinking about Australia with the decision to de-recognize the government of Democratic Kampuchea at the time that Pol Pot was in charge in Kampuchea. This act of de-recognition is something which we hadn't had to grapple with before in Australia, of how you de-recognize. But going back to the points just made very helpfully by Jonathan, I think that I take some of my guidance on these things and the way they apply to ASEAN from the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, where it's about states, but a state accredits somebody to be its head of mission. The states, in that case, are the governments, because it's the government that provides the basis for the acceptance of a head of mission in another country. And in that case, the state is represented by the foreign minister of the country, because the foreign minister is the one who signs the credentials. Well, the foreign minister puts the credentials to the head of state to sign, so that they are taken then to the receiving state and its government. In the cases we're looking at now concerning Myanmar, there are a couple that stand out. One of them is the ambassador to the United Nations, whose name is Chomo Tun. He is the person who is accredited as the permanent representative of Myanmar to the United Nations in New York, and he is still in that capacity, because although he said that he could no longer represent the military after they took over power on the 1st of February, he is still there. And efforts by the military to remove his nomination or his place as permanent representative have not been accepted by the UN. On the other hand, in the United Kingdom, the other country that matters, the ambassador to the UK also decided that he would not stand with the military regime, and he saw himself as representing Myanmar as a people. The British more or less accepted that he could be removed by the government, or by the purported government of the military in Myanmar, by firing him and putting in his place the next person on the diplomatic list, who happens to be a man called Dr. Chit Wen. So those are the only two countries where this seems to have happened. To come to the ASEAN question that you mentioned, the Myanmar ambassador to Indonesia is a man who was appointed by the previous government, the Aung San Suu Kyi government, as ambassador to Indonesia, and he's still in that position. And he did not elect to set himself aside from the military. So he remained in that position. What he has clearly done is to be involved by the ASEAN Secretariat as the interlocutor for them in arranging the ASEAN meeting that took place in Jakarta yesterday. on the 24th of April. He would have been the person who would have provided advice back to the foreign ministry, and perhaps also, we don't know this, directly to Min Aung Hlaing about this meeting and whether he should be there or not, and then perhaps provide a briefing on what he should say. So there's a direct relationship in that sense between the ASEAN Secretariat and the Myanmar military authorities. I don't see this as particularly relevant to a highly technical discussion about recognition, because this ambassador has done a job at the, with the collusion, if you can put it into a negative sense, of the authorities in the foreign ministry in Yangon, in Naypyidaw. And the meeting took place yesterday. What that meeting did was to set up a heads of government meeting between the members of the ASEAN community about what should be done about the present situation in Myanmar. They have started from the standpoint that ASEAN does not interfere in the internal affairs of its member states. And everybody agrees with that, but then what that actually means in real life is different. So the ASEAN heads of government decided at their meeting to endorse a statement by the chair of ASEAN, or by the chair of the meeting, who is the president of Indonesia, but the real chair of ASEAN at the moment, because of rotational principles, is the Sultan of Brunei. And they produced a set of 5 principles, which include the news that ASEAN itself will send an envoy. This envoy will be accepted by the Myanmar authorities, that is to say the military authorities, as a person who can go to Myanmar, and that approval is needed because after all, a plane has to land. People have to get out of the plane, go through customs and the other things that people have to do when they travel. So there's involvement by the military in receiving the envoy from ASEAN. This envoy, having arrived there, then becomes relevant in the recognition terms, in terms of what sort of a person he is and who he's accepted by. The National Unity Government, which has been put in place as the parallel government of Myanmar, has welcomed this news. And they say in their statement, "We welcome the encouraging news that ASEAN leaders have reached consensus that the military violence must stop. This is what the National Unity Government has been calling for. We eagerly await the engagement by the ASEAN Secretary General as mandated by this meeting." So the 2 governments, if I can put it that way, of Myanmar, the military government, using that term advisedly, and the National Unity Government, also used advisedly, have both agreed that ASEAN has this role. And when ASEAN sends its person there, as they have said themselves in their principles, they will see this person as somebody who comes in and then works on all these points of consensus. So ASEAN's envoy will facilitate the mediation of the dialogue process. It will set up constructive dialogue among all parties concerned. It will provide humanitarian assistance. And 5th, the last of these points is very important. The special envoy shall visit Myanmar to meet with all parties concerned. In other words, this envoy will go to Myanmar, will be able to get into the country and meet with all parties concerned in Myanmar. This itself accepts that there are parties within Myanmar who need to be part of the discussion about the cessation of violence, peaceful solution, the provision of humanitarian assistance, and that gives this person a particularly strong role. Now, the person's not named yet, but I guess that's all something which is happening now, being considered, or maybe they know who it's going to be, but it hasn't yet come out. So in a sense, the question of formal recognition doesn't arise in the context of ASEAN, because ASEAN has made it clear that nobody has been recognized as the government of Myanmar, but they are all parties who need to be brought together by the envoy in order to mediate the dialogue process. And that's interesting to me, very interesting indeed.
Thanks for the question about state recognition of either the military regime or the civilian representatives within Myanmar. So the short answer to this is that other countries, as a matter of international law and international relations, need to maintain some level of flexibility for the sake of pragmatism. They need room to maneuver, in other words, in terms of deciding what kinds of strategies they want to employ in their relations with Myanmar, which is Myanmar the state, as well as with the Myanmar people. And as a result of that, they want flexibility in terms of deciding who they want to identify as the voice of the state or the voice of the people, and who is eligible or the person to engage in terms of negotiations or discussions, and in terms of the person or the entities that will be treated as being able to make decisions on behalf of the Myanmar state or the Myanmar people. So as a matter of pragmatism, I think for the time being, much of the international community has been reluctant to make any kinds of formal indications as to who they're willing to recognize as the government of Myanmar at this point in time. And as a result, you see them very much adhering narrowly to the Estrada Doctrine, where they maintain recognition of Myanmar, the state, but they're withholding recognition of any government at this time. Now, in terms of what we may see going forward, in terms of what will constitute recognition at some point in the near future, there's a distinction between express recognition and implied recognition. So express recognition, this is exemplified or indicated by acts such as public declarations, so declarations that are made by a state or a country, indicating who they're willing to work with and who that they recognize, and the status of the people or entities that they will recognize. So this would be indicative or illustrated by, for example, the United States making a public declaration through state channels, through the United States government channels, regarding who it will accord as recognition in terms of speaking on behalf of the Myanmar state, and who it might end up recognizing for the sake of negotiations or discussions as the government. That has not happened yet, but over time, this is probably something that we will see some decision being made eventually. Alternative to express recognition, there is implied recognition. So implied recognition, this is where there is no explicit statement or formal declaration, but instead there is something as an action. So for example, meeting with representatives with the capacity being indicated as being meeting between heads of government, or meeting between representatives of government, or meetings between heads of state or representatives of the state. And so in these kinds of situations, those kinds of meetings would then be an indication of an implied recognition of some kind. So hence the level of sensitivity that we witnessed. So recently, there were invitations sent out by the Myanmar government to the chambers of commerce from the United States and the European Union, and you saw some reluctance from the American and the European chambers of commerce to attend those meetings, because they were reluctant to give any kind of implied recognition or anything that might be construed as recognition of the government of Myanmar.
That I look at here, the United States, Australia, and a number of other countries have said they are not going to provide an aid program that will be delivered to the government. And by government, they mean there the military government in the country now. They are going to try to work out how to deliver their humanitarian assistance to the country through civil society and NGOs. And we, in fact, in our Australia Myanmar Institute have encouraged a rise in the Australian aid program and its redirection so that it goes through civil society. And that would be interpreted by, I would say, the Australian government as meaning that it won't work through the military authorities to run its aid program. It will work through representatives of civil society. And that probably means, when they come down to the detail of this, working with the civil disobedience movement, the CRPH, that's the committee representing the P'yodangsu Hluttaw, the parliament, and with other bodies that they would see as meeting a civil society benchmark of some sort, yet to be really clear, but not through the military. Therefore, the maintenance of an aid program, and it could be a lot of money, will not be run through the military authorities themselves. So that, in fact, stands as a statement of unwillingness to work through the military, who have seized power on the 1st of February, but through this other process. And what we would do in Australia, I hope, is to see a process evolve where bodies like ours, like our Australian Myanmar Institute, will provide advice to the government, the Australian government, about how to direct the aid program in these circumstances. This is something which, as I understand it, has been welcomed by the National Unity Government, in other words, the alternative or parallel government which has been set up, but we don't know yet how that would work in practice. But it does have a bearing on who recognises what in the country, because that would see us working very differently from the way we've worked in the past. Thank you.